It came wrapped in oilcloth and river mud, tied to the saddlebag of a dying courier whose horse had been driven nearly to collapse across 3 mountain passes. The weapon was unremarkable at first glance, a single-handed blade with a leather-wrapped grip worn smooth by use, its crossguard shaped like 2 descending wings. But Eduward Fezmond recognized it the moment his sergeant, a broad-shouldered half-dwarf named Breck, unwrapped it on the camp table. The firelight caught the maker's mark on the ricasso, a tiny wyvern coiled around the letter D, pressed into the steel by a smith who had worked only for one house in the entire Thornmark region. House Dorvem. Eduward set down his tin cup. The wine inside it had gone cold an hour ago, and he had barely touched it.
Around him, his company of mercenaries, 17 men and women who had followed him across 4 campaigns and 2 wars, went about the business of a night camp, sharpening tools, mending leather, trading low voices over embers. None of them looked at the sword. None of them had reason to. He did not touch it, not yet. Instead, he read the letter, which the courier, now breathing shallowly under a wool blanket near the fire, had pressed into his hands with the trembling conviction of someone who believed delivery was the last duty left to him. The paper was water-stained and had been folded so many times that the creases were almost tears. The handwriting was precise but hurried, the pen strokes of someone who had trained in a good scriptorium and then written this particular thing in considerable fear. Lord Fezmond, it began, not the warmth of a friend, not the formality of a stranger, just the title, and the assumption that he would understand the weight behind it.
Your children are alive, a boy and a girl. They were born in the spring of the year House Dorvem fell, and they do not know who their father is. Their mother was Seraphine, 5th daughter of Viscount Dorvem, who died of fever 6 weeks after their birth. Before she died, she told me everything. I have kept this secret for 2 years, since the house was destroyed. I can keep it no longer. The twins are in danger. The letter was signed only with a symbol, a pressed flower, dried flat, that Eduward did not recognize. He folded it. He set it face down on the table. Then he sat with his hands flat on the wood for a long time, very still, while the fire crackled, and Breck pretended not to watch him from across the camp. 10 years. Eduward had been 23 the night it happened.
His father, Count Aldrich Fezmond, a man who had always treated political advantage as a currency worth any price, had invited him to a private supper in the east wing of Fezmond Hall, away from the household staff. The wine had tasted faintly of something Eduward couldn't name, a sweetness beneath the tannin that he had attributed to an unfamiliar vintage. By the time the effects took hold, he had understood. He had understood everything, including that he was powerless to stop it. He remembered a woman's face, dark-haired, afraid, also unwilling, and then a merciful blankness that had lasted until dawn. He had never seen her again. He had never known her name. His father had died of a wasting sickness 4 years later, taking with him whatever political bargain he had been pursuing that night.
Eduward had inherited the comital seat, reorganized the household finances, and spent the following years building the mercenary company that now paid better wages than any lord-standing army in the province. He had not returned to Fezmond Hall in 2 years. He had tried, with the methodical determination of a man who understands that certain rooms in the mind must stay locked, not to think about that night at all. He picked up the sword. The grip fit his hand like it had been made for him, which it had not. It had been made for someone else entirely, but the balance was extraordinary. a quality of steel and craft that the mountain smiths of the Dorven highlands had been famous for before the house's destruction. He set it down again and called across the camp in a voice that gave nothing away. "Breck, we move at first light, not south, north." Breck looked at him for a moment, then at the sword on the table, then back at him. He asked no questions. He never did.
He simply turned and began waking people up. Eduward sat alone a while longer. Outside, beyond the firelight, the Thornmark mountains rose in dark silence against a sky full of cold stars, and somewhere in their shadow, 2 children who did not know his name were, according to a letter written in fear, in danger. He was not certain he was the right person to find them. He was fairly certain he was the only one who would. The Thornmark Road was not a single road. It was a suggestion, a series of packed earth tracks and ancient dwarven-cut switchbacks that connected the lowland towns to the mining settlements higher up, broken at intervals by landslides and seasonal rivers and the sheer indifference of the mountains to human convenience. Eduward's company had traveled worse. They had also traveled with clearer purpose, which was the thing that made this particular journey feel strange in his chest, like a coin spinning in a hollow space he hadn't known was there.
The company numbered 17, though they functioned more like a small and unusually competent family, the kind that expressed affection through mockery and trust through silence. There was Breck, who handled logistics with dwarven precision and had never once asked Eduward a personal question in 6 years of service. There was Mira of the Salt Marsh, a human woman of indeterminate middle age, who served as their field medic and carried a staff that she was better at swinging than healing with. There was Fen, their youngest, barely 19, a gnome who had joined them 3 campaigns ago with a talent for picking locks and an unfortunate habit of narrating his own achievements in the third person. And there were 12 others, each with histories that Eduward knew better than most employers bothered to learn, because he had made it his practice to understand what he was asking people to risk their lives for. He told them nothing specific.
He told them they were moving north to follow a lead on a missing persons case, private client, above average pay. This was technically true. They accepted it with the professional skepticism of people who had learned that their captain's half explanations almost always became full ones eventually. On the second day out of camp, Mira fell into step beside him on a stretch of road wide enough for 2 horses abreast, and rode in companionable quiet for long enough that he knew she was waiting for him to speak first. "I'm not going to ask," she said finally, which was her way of asking. He looked at the mountains ahead. The higher peaks still held snow even in late summer, and the light on them was the particular silver gray that meant weather was building somewhere behind the ridgeline. "There are children," he said. "They need to be found. Yours." The pause before he answered was answer enough.
Mira made a small sound that was not quite sympathy and not quite judgment, somewhere in the precise register of a person who has seen a great deal of the world and stopped being surprised by the shapes trouble takes. How old? 8 years. Another silence. Then, they'll be old enough to be frightened, and old enough to remember being found. He had nothing to say to that, so he said nothing. They reached the town of Greyvale on the 3rd day, a mining settlement of perhaps 800 souls built against the lower face of the Thornmark escarpment, where the iron veins ran shallow enough for surface extraction. The buildings were stone and timber, practical and low, designed to withstand the weight of winter rather than impress visitors. The market square smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, and the particular mineral sharpness of freshly turned earth. The locals moved with the unhurried efficiency of people who had learned that the mountain rewarded patience and punished haste.
Eduward dismounted at the inn and asked the stable hand, a half-elven girl of perhaps 12, with the quiet, assessing eyes of someone who had grown up in a place where strangers sometimes brought trouble, whether she knew the name Dorvem. The girl's expression didn't change, but her hands, which had been reaching for his horse's bridle, went still for just a moment. "Dorvem has been done 2 years," she said. "Nobody here uses that name anymore." "I'm not looking for the house," Eduward said. "I'm looking for children, a boy and a girl, 8 years old, twins." The girl looked at him for a long time. She had the particular stillness of a child who had learned when to be careful. "You should speak to the keeper of the Waystone Chapel," she said at last. "She takes in strays." She said it like she hadn't said anything at all, and led his horse away.
Edward stood in the muddy yard and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the precursor to it, the thing that arrives first and has no name. He did not notice, because he was not yet looking for it, the shadow that detached itself from the alley mouth across the square and disappeared before he turned around. He would not have recognized the man anyway. He had never met anyone who worked for Count Pallone. Not yet. The Waystone Chapel was older than the town around it, built by dwarven pilgrims 3 centuries before the first human settlement. Its stones fitted without mortar in the traditional underhall style. Each block angled slightly inward, so the whole structure leaned together, like a group of friends sharing a secret. Inside, it smelled of beeswax and dried sage, and the specific mineral incense that Waystone clergy favored, a blend that was supposed to ease passage between this world and whatever lay beyond it.
The keeper was a dwarf woman of considerable age, her white hair braided and pinned under a gray cloth cap, her face carved by decades into an expression of patient watchfulness. She was sweeping the nave with slow, deliberate strokes when Edward entered. She did not stop sweeping. "I was told you might know of 2 children," he said. "Twins, 8 years old. The name their mother used was Dorvem." The keeper swept for another 3 strokes before she answered. "And what name does their father use?" "Fezmond," he said. "Edward. I hold the Fezmond County seat." She stopped sweeping. She looked at him with the thoroughness of a woman who had spent a lifetime evaluating people and had no patience left for performance. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone sent by the Count's enemies to take what they couldn't reach through politics." She set the broom against the wall. "Sit down."
"There are things you need to know before I tell you anything about the children." He sat on a cold stone bench and listened. The keeper's name was Dova. She had been the one who wrote the letter, not in her own hand, which would have been recognizable to certain people, but dictated to a young clerk she trusted. She had sent the Dorvem blade along because it was the only proof she had that what she was saying was true, and because she had hoped that anyone who recognized it would understand the stakes. The twins were named Elara and Corin. They were in Greyvale, had been for nearly 2 years, since the night a woman named Seraphine Dorvem had arrived at the chapel door carrying 2 infants and burning with fever. She had lived long enough to give names, to press the old sword into Dova's hands, and to speak a single sentence that Dova had written down afterward and kept locked in the chapel's strongbox. Their father didn't know. Tell him when you think he can be trusted.
Edward said nothing for a long moment. "She protected me," he said finally. "Not a question." "She protected the children," Dova corrected gently. "You were part of that calculation, yes." "The children were currently in the back garden," she said, "where they spent most mornings helping the chapel's elderly gardener turn soil. They were healthy. Elara was quieter and more watchful. Corin asked more questions than anyone had answers for. They knew they were orphans. They did not know anything else. It was at this point that Breck appeared in the chapel doorway, not running because Breck never ran in a way that would alarm people, but moving with the particular controlled urgency that Edward had learned to read over 6 years of working together. "We have company," Breck said, "armed, not uniformed. 8 that I can see, maybe more in the side streets. They arrived in 2 groups, about 20 minutes apart, which means they had a scout."
Dova's face did not change, but her hands went to the prayer beads at her belt. "Pilone," she said. "Not a guess, a recognition." Edward looked at her sharply. "You know that name." "Count Pilone has been systematically acquiring the assets and debts of collapsed noble houses for 3 years, Dova said. House Dorvem was one of them. He has been looking for the heirs since before I wrote to you. I thought I had been careful. It appears I wasn't careful enough." Here was the thing about Pilone that Edward would only understand much later. The full picture assembled from fragments, the way a pattern becomes visible only when you step back far enough to see it whole. Pilone was not simply a criminal, he was a collector. He acquired ruined houses not for their debts or their assets, but for their bloodlines, for the quiet, devastating leverage that came from controlling the last surviving heirs of families that still had legal standing in the provincial courts.
Children of noble blood, if they survived long enough to be recognized, could make claims, could challenge transfers, could destabilize arrangements that Pilone had spent years building. He could not allow that. Eduward stood. He reached across the bench for the Dorvem sword, which he had brought with him without quite knowing why, and buckled it at his hip beside his own blade. 2 swords felt excessive. He did it anyway. "How many exits does this chapel have?" he asked Dova. 3. The front, the garden gate, and a tunnel below the altar that leads to the old Dorven access passage. It hasn't been used in 40 years. It'll have to do. He turned to Breck. "Get Mira and Fen inside through the garden. I need the children moved." Breck was already gone. Dova caught his arm as he turned toward the garden door. "They're going to want to know who you are," she said. "The children. What do you plan to tell them?" He hadn't thought about it.
He thought about it now, standing in a chapel that smelled of beeswax and sage, with armed men converging on the square outside, and a sword at each hip that had been made for 2 different families, and realized that the honest answer was also the only one that would matter. "The truth," he said, "when there's time." The garden was a narrow strip of turned earth behind the chapel, enclosed by a low stone wall and an ancient pear tree that had been pruned into arthritic angles by decades of mountain winters. The children were there. Eduward saw them through the garden door before they saw him, and the sight stopped him for a full second in a way that no enemy formation ever had. They were 8 years old and entirely themselves. Ilara sat cross-legged in the dirt beside a row of late-season turnips, examining something small in her palm with the focused attention of a scholar.
Corin stood on the low wall, arms out for balance, narrating something to the elderly gardener, a wizened halfling who was listening with the patient expression of a man who had learned that the best response to an 8-year-old's lecture on the structural integrity of stone walls was to nod occasionally and continue weeding. Mira appeared through the garden gate a moment later, moving with the calm authority she deployed in emergencies, and spoke quietly to the gardener. The halfling straightened, read her face, and said something to the children in a low voice. Both of them looked immediately toward Edward. It was Corin who crossed the garden first, because Corin, as Dova had said, asked questions before he assessed situations. He stood 3 feet away and looked up with eyes that were dark and direct, and carried in them something Edward recognized with a start that was almost physical, the particular shape of his own mother's gaze, which he had not seen in 20 years.
Ilara came to stand beside her brother. In her palm was a small iron arrowhead, ancient and pitted, the kind that turned up in Thornmark soil everywhere because the dwarves had fought 3 wars here in the centuries before the human settlements arrived. She held it the way scholars hold evidence. Edward crouched down so he was at their level. He was aware of Breck appearing over the chapel wall behind him and making a hand signal that meant time was short. He was aware of Fen somewhere on the chapel roof, doing whatever Fen did when situations required someone small and inconspicuous. He was aware of all of this, and none of it was as loud as the silence in front of him. "My name is Edward," he said. He kept his voice level. "I knew your mother, a long time ago." Ilara looked at him steadily. Then she held out the arrowhead. He didn't understand the gesture. He took it anyway, and as he did, she pointed to the sword at his right hip, the one that was not his own.
"That's the Dorven sword," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as though she were identifying a tool rather than a legacy. "Keeper Dova showed it to us. She said our mother left it." "She did," Eduward said. "Are you here to take us somewhere?" Corin asked, not afraid, calibrating. "Yes." "Is it safe?" It was the most honest question he had been asked in years, and he had the grace not to lie to a child who was old enough to know what the question cost. "Not yet," he said, "but it will be." From beyond the garden wall came the sound of boots on cobblestone, multiple pairs, moving without the casualness of local traffic. Breck dropped from the wall into the garden, landing lightly for a man his size, and crossed to Eduward in 4 steps. 6 at the front, 3 at the gate. Fens counted 2 more on the chapel roof, ours, not theirs. They're going to move in the next few minutes.
Pilone's men were professionals. They had covered the exits, deployed a scout in advance, and arrived in staggered waves to avoid drawing attention. What they had not accounted for was that Eduward's company had spent 6 years working in exactly this kind of terrain, mountain towns with narrow streets and old buildings full of alternative routes, and that Fen, specifically, had once extracted an entire merchant family from a siege situation in a town half this size, using nothing but a rope and a bakery chimney. The tunnel beneath the altar was 40 years of disuse, cobwebs, and water-dripping silence. Eduward carried Ilara on his back because she was the smaller of the two and had not complained about it. Mira took Corin's hand with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who understood that children in crisis need contact more than they need words.
Fen led with a cantrip of dancing lights he cast from a small carved rod at his belt, 4 glowing motes bobbing ahead like cheerful omissions in the dark. Because gnome cantrips required no spell slot expenditure, and the boy had learned early that light was worth more in a tunnel than a drawn knife. Breck took the rear, axe out, moving with the contained readiness of someone who fully expected to use it and was comfortable with that expectation. Above them, they could hear the muffled sound of Pilone's men entering the chapel. They could hear Dova's voice, steady, unimpressed, offering them exactly nothing useful, and the sound of furniture being moved. Dova had agreed to buy them 10 minutes. Edward suspected she would buy them more, not out of recklessness, but out of the particular stubbornness of someone who had been keeping dangerous secrets for 2 years and had decided that today was the last day she would do it quietly.
The tunnel opened into the old dwarven access passage, a broad, low-ceilinged corridor cut through bedrock that ran beneath the eastern quarter of the town and emerged after a quarter-mile of darkness through an iron door into a natural cave mouth above the river. The air that hit them when Breck pushed the door open was cold and sharp and smelled of water and stone and the specific clarity of high altitude. The rest of the company was waiting with the horses. Corin, emerging from the cave into late afternoon mountain light, stopped and looked back at the town. He was 8 years old, and his expression held a weight that children should not have to carry, the weight of understanding that going forward means not going back,
that safety and home are sometimes different places. Edward stood beside him. He did not say anything about the future, because the future was something he would need to build rather than describe.
He did not make promises he wasn't certain he could keep, because the children were old enough to remember broken ones. He held out the Dorven sword, hilt first, the way you offer something to someone it belongs to. Elara looked at it. She looked at him. "That's yours," she said. Not dismissive, precise. "It goes with the other one." He didn't know what she meant for a moment. Then he understood. She had seen both swords and understood instinctively that they were a set. Two blades from two houses, paired at his hip not by design, but by circumstance, which was the way most true things in the world were assembled. He sheathed it. The ride north took 3 days along the high road, where Bilon's men would not easily follow without committing more resources than a quiet pursuit allowed, and Edward's company made certain, through a series of careful maneuvers that Breck executed with the focused pleasure of a man practicing a beloved craft, that pursuit was neither easy nor quiet.
By the time they reached the Fezmond border post and crossed into territory where Pilon's legal reach did not extend, the weather that had been building behind the northern ridgeline had broken into a sweeping autumn storm that filled the passes with rain and rendered the mountain roads essentially impassable. There would be other battles. Edward understood this clearly. Pilon was not the kind of man who stopped because an attempt failed. He was the kind who reassessed and tried again, and the question of what the twins represented legally, what claims their existence might support or threaten, was not a question that would resolve itself. It would need to be resolved deliberately, through courts and lawyers, and the kind of careful political maneuvering that Edward had spent years avoiding and would now need to learn. He was surprised to find that he did not mind.
On the third evening, at a roadside inn where Mira had commandeered the best room and installed both children in it, with the authority of someone who considered negotiation a formality, Edward sat on a bench outside the stable and turned the small iron arrowhead over in his fingers. He had kept it in his pocket the whole journey. He wasn't entirely sure why. Elara appeared in the doorway of the inn, wrapped in a too large cloak that belonged to one of the company. She was barefoot on the flagstones and did not seem to notice the cold. She looked at the arrowhead. "Dwarven," she said. "Third period, probably, before the compact." He stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Keeper Dova taught us. She said history is what keeps you from making the same mistakes twice." A pause. "She said our mother believed that." The storm had eased to a steady drizzle, the kind that asked nothing of you, just fell quietly on everything without making demands.
The mountains were invisible behind cloud, but he knew they were there. They always were, patient in the way that only very old and very large things could afford to be. He held out the arrowhead again. This time, Elara crossed the flagstones and took it, wrapped her fingers around it, and stood beside him in the rain for a moment before going back inside. No words, no ceremony, just the transfer of a small piece of iron from one hand to another, the way inheritance actually worked. Not in the grand gestures of official halls, but in the quiet exchanges between people who were still figuring out what they meant to each other. Edward sat a while longer, both swords at his side, the sound of his company's voices drifting from inside the inn, and thought that his father had believed he was arranging a future the night he poured that wine. He had been, in the end, but not the one he'd imagined. The futures that mattered were almost never the ones anyone planned.
The mountain said nothing. The rain continued. Somewhere inside, Corin was almost certainly asking Mira a question she didn't have an answer to. It was, by any measure, a beginning.